Some people believe the hardest part of losing someone is standing beside their grave, listening to the final prayer, and accepting that they're gone forever. But for Margaret Ellis, that wasn't the moment her world collapsed. The real heartbreak came only seconds later, when a complete stranger walked through the mourners gathered beneath gray skies, leaned close enough that only Margaret could hear, and whispered 6 words that shattered 38 years of marriage in an instant. He lied to you about everything. Before Margaret could ask a single question, the woman disappeared into the crowd as quietly as she had arrived, leaving behind nothing except confusion, fear, and an old brass key pressed into Margaret's trembling hand. In that single moment, the man everyone had spent the afternoon honoring as a loving husband, devoted father, respected neighbor, and trusted friend suddenly became someone Margaret realized she might never have truly known at all. Every memory they had built together suddenly felt uncertain. Every anniversary, every family vacation, every promise Richard Ellis had ever made now carried a question she never imagined she would have to ask. Who was the woman dressed in black? What secret had Richard protected until his final breath? And why wait until the funeral to reveal it? Sometimes the greatest mysteries don't begin with a crime. They begin with a funeral and a whisper that refuses to leave your mind. Stories like this remind us that the people closest to us can carry secrets we never imagine, hidden behind ordinary smiles and familiar routines. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos here on Story Chamber, where every story challenges what we think we know about trust, love, family, and the hidden truths that could change everything. Rain fell steadily over the small cemetery outside the quiet Ohio town where Margaret Ellis had spent nearly her entire adult life. At 61 years old, she stood beneath a black umbrella surrounded by relatives, neighbors, lifelong friends, and members of the church community that had known her husband, Richard Ellis, for decades. The pastor's voice carried softly through the cool afternoon air as he spoke about faith, commitment, and a life well lived. Richard had died only 6 days earlier after a brief battle with pancreatic cancer, and nearly everyone in attendance described him using the same words: dependable, generous, patient, and honest. He had served in the military as a young man, volunteered countless weekends helping veterans, coached Little League baseball long after his own children had grown, and never missed Sunday service unless illness kept him home. To the people gathered around his casket, Richard Ellis represented the kind of man every community hoped to have and every family hoped to keep. Margaret believed every word spoken about him because she had spent 38 years believing she knew exactly who her husband was. She had loved him through financial struggles, career changes, sleepless nights raising children, family celebrations, and finally the difficult months of watching cancer slowly steal the strength from the man she had promised to love until death separated them. Standing beside his grave, she believed the hardest chapter of her life had already begun. She had no way of knowing that the funeral itself was only the beginning of a story far more painful than grief. When the pastor closed his Bible and invited everyone to bow their heads for one final prayer, Margaret squeezed a folded handkerchief tightly between her fingers, trying to steady herself as the first ropes prepared to lower Richard's casket into the earth. Around her, quiet sobs mixed with the sound of falling rain. Her daughter, Emily, rested a comforting hand on her shoulder while her son, Michael, stared silently at the polished wooden casket that held the father he deeply admired. Everything unfolded exactly as Margaret expected until she noticed movement near the back of the gathering. A woman she had never seen before stepped forward slowly, dressed entirely in black, carrying no flowers and speaking to no one. She wasn't listed among the family. She wasn't a neighbor. She wasn't from church. Yet she walked with quiet confidence, as though she belonged there just as much as anyone else. Instead of approaching the casket, she walked directly toward Margaret. The stranger's face showed neither anger nor sadness. It held something much more unsettling, a look of quiet certainty. Without introducing herself, she leaned close enough that Margaret could feel her breath despite the cool afternoon air. Then, in a calm voice barely louder than a whisper, she said, "He lied to you about everything." Margaret's heartbeat seemed to stop. Before she could ask what those words meant or even demand the woman's name, the stranger gently closed Margaret's fingers around a small brass key, turned away, and disappeared among the mourners as though she had never been there at all. Margaret stood motionless, barely hearing the rest of the ceremony. The rain continued falling. Friends offered hugs she scarcely noticed. Family members spoke words of comfort she could no longer process. Her attention remained fixed on the small brass key hidden inside her clenched hand. It looked old, worn smooth by years of use, with no tag, no markings, and no explanation. Why had a stranger chosen this moment? Why not while Richard was alive? Why wait until there would never be an opportunity to confront him? As the cemetery slowly emptied and the final guests returned to their cars, Margaret slipped the key in her coat pocket, unaware that this tiny piece of metal would soon unlock a truth capable of rewriting nearly 4 decades of her life. She left the cemetery believing she was returning home as Richard Ellis's grieving widow. Before another week had passed, she would begin to wonder whether she had ever truly known the man she had married. Some people spend an entire lifetime believing they know the person sleeping beside them, sharing meals across the same kitchen table, celebrating birthdays, anniversaries, holidays, and countless ordinary moments that slowly become the foundation of a marriage. They believe trust is built one day at a time until it becomes something too solid to question. Margaret Ellis believed exactly that. For 38 years, she never imagined there would come a day when everything she thought she knew about her husband would be questioned in less than 10 seconds. It happened on a quiet afternoon beneath gray skies, surrounded by people who loved the same man she had loved for nearly 4 decades. They had gathered to say goodbye to Richard Ellis, a husband, father, grandfather, veteran, and respected member of their small Ohio community. As the pastor prepared to offer one final prayer, Margaret thought she was experiencing the most painful moment of her life. She had no idea that her grief was only the beginning. Before another hour had passed, a stranger would whisper 6 words that would turn every treasured memory into a mystery. Those 6 words would send Margaret on a journey she never wanted, forcing her to question whether the man she had buried was ever truly the man she married. Stories like this remind us that life can change without warning, often when we least expect it. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos here on Story Chamber, where every story uncovers hidden truths, unforgettable mysteries, and life-changing moments that stay with you long after the ending. Rain had fallen since early morning, covering the cemetery in a quiet mist that seemed to match the mood of everyone gathered there. The weather forecast had promised only light showers, but by the time the funeral procession reached the graveside, dark clouds had settled across the sky, as if nature itself had decided this farewell deserved silence instead of sunshine. Margaret Ellis stood beneath a black umbrella, her hands trembling slightly as she held a neatly folded white handkerchief that Richard had once given her during their first Christmas together. At 61 years old, she had imagined growing old beside him, complaining about aching knees, spoiling future great-grandchildren, and sitting together on their front porch watching the seasons change. Cancer had stolen those dreams with heartbreaking speed. Only 4 months earlier, Richard had still been mowing the lawn, fixing neighbors' fences, and laughing with friends after Sunday church services. Then came the diagnosis that changed everything: pancreatic cancer. The doctors tried every treatment they believed might buy more time, but the disease moved faster than anyone expected. Margaret never left his side during those final weeks. She held his hand through every sleepless night, listened to every promise that everything would somehow be all right, and believed until his final breath that love alone could somehow keep him alive. When Richard died at 63, the entire town mourned. People described him as dependable, generous, honest, and kind. There was not a single reason for Margaret to question the life they had built together. At least, not until that afternoon. The pastor spoke gently about faith, forgiveness, and the importance of remembering the good left behind by those who have gone. Friends wiped tears from their faces while family members quietly embraced one another. Richard's son, Michael, stood with his wife only a few feet away, staring silently at the polished oak casket that would soon disappear beneath the earth. Their daughter, Emily, rested one comforting hand on Margaret's shoulder without saying a word. Sometimes silence carries more comfort than conversation ever could. Margaret listened as neighbors shared memories of Richard helping repair roofs after storms, volunteering at the Veterans Center, coaching youth baseball years after his own children had grown up, and quietly paying grocery bills for struggling families without ever expecting recognition. Every story sounded exactly like the man she knew. Richard Ellis had never cared about attention. He simply believed that decent people should help one another whenever they could. Looking around the crowd, Margaret noticed just how many lives he had touched. Nearly every face reflected genuine sadness. Some people had driven several hours simply to say goodbye. Others had known Richard since childhood. As painful as the moment was, Margaret found comfort believing that her husband would be remembered as a good man. She closed her eyes during the final prayer, whispering a silent goodbye she could never bring herself to say aloud while Richard was still alive. When the prayer ended and the funeral director nodded for the casket to be lowered, something caught Margaret's attention. A woman she had never seen before stood several yards away near a large oak tree overlooking the cemetery. She wore a simple black coat, black gloves, and carried no umbrella despite the steady rain. Water soaked her dark hair, yet she didn't seem to notice or care. She wasn't crying. She wasn't speaking to anyone. She simply watched Margaret with an expression that was impossible to understand. Margaret quietly searched her memory, wondering if perhaps the woman had worked with Richard years ago or attended church without ever introducing herself. But nothing felt familiar. As family members slowly stepped back from the graveside, the woman began walking forward. Her pace was calm, deliberate, and strangely confident, as though she had spent the entire afternoon waiting for exactly this moment. No one stopped her. No one asked who she was. The mourners assumed she belonged there, just as everyone else did. Margaret remained frozen as the stranger approached until only a few inches separated them. The woman leaned close enough that no one else could hear what she was about to say. Then, in a voice so soft it was almost lost beneath the sound of falling rain, she whispered, "He lied to you about everything." Margaret felt the air leave her lungs. Before she could ask a single question, the woman gently placed something cold into her hand, closed Margaret's fingers around it, turned away, and disappeared into the slowly departing crowd without ever looking back. Margaret remained standing beside Richard's grave long after most of the guests had returned to their cars. Her daughter asked twice if she was ready to leave, but Margaret barely heard her. Her attention rested entirely on the small object hidden inside her clenched hand. When she finally looked down, she discovered an old brass key unlike any she had seen before. It carried no label, no number, no initials, nothing that could explain where it belonged or why a stranger believed Margaret should have it. She replayed those 6 words over and over in her mind. He lied to you about everything. The sentence felt impossible. Richard had many ordinary flaws. He forgot birthdays occasionally. He left unfinished projects in the garage. He hated discussing money. But a life built on lies? Margaret couldn't accept that. Yet the certainty in the woman's voice refused to leave her thoughts. She slipped the key carefully into her coat pocket before walking slowly toward her car, Unaware that this ordinary-looking piece of brass would soon unlock answers she had never searched for and reveal secrets Richard Ellis had protected for longer than anyone could have imagined. Before the next sunrise, Margaret would begin questioning every chapter of the marriage she believed had been built on honesty, and she would soon discover that some truths refuse to stay buried, even after the person keeping them is gone. Margaret Ellis barely slept the night after Richard's funeral. Every time she closed her eyes, she found herself standing beside the freshly covered grave, hearing the stranger's voice repeating the same 6 words with frightening clarity. "He lied to you about everything." By sunrise, she had convinced herself that grief was distorting her judgment. Losing someone after 38 years could make anyone question reality. Perhaps the woman had mistaken Richard for someone else. Perhaps she was mentally unwell. Perhaps the key belonged to nothing important at all. Those explanations were comforting because they allowed Margaret to protect the memory of the man she had loved for most of her adult life. But each time she reached into the pocket of the black coat she had worn to the funeral, the cold brass key reminded her that the encounter had been real. Someone had waited until the very moment Richard was gone forever before choosing to reveal a secret. That timing alone troubled her more than the words themselves. Whoever the woman was, she had wanted Margaret to discover something only after Richard could no longer answer questions. As morning light filled the quiet house, Margaret looked around at the family photographs lining the walls. Richard smiled back at her for vacations in Florida, Thanksgiving dinners, graduations, camping trips, and Christmas mornings. Every picture represented a memory she had treasured. Now she wondered if those smiles had been hiding something she had simply never noticed. The house felt painfully different without Richard's familiar routines. For years, he had been the first person awake every morning, grinding fresh coffee beans before reading the local newspaper at the kitchen table. Even after retirement, he followed the same schedule with remarkable consistency, joking that routine was the secret to a peaceful life. Margaret stood in the kitchen, holding a coffee mug she could barely bring herself to drink from because it reminded her of him. Her daughter, Emily, had offered to stay for a few days, but Margaret insisted she needed time alone. She wasn't entirely honest about why. She hadn't told anyone about the woman at the funeral or the mysterious key hidden inside her dresser drawer. Part of her feared that saying it aloud would somehow make the nightmare real. Another part feared that someone might encourage her to ignore it. Throughout the morning, Margaret walked through every room in the house, testing the key in desk drawers, cabinets, old trunks in the attic, the padlock on Richard's workshop, and even an antique writing desk inherited from his father. Nothing fit. Every failed attempt strengthened her belief that perhaps the stranger had handed her the wrong key. Yet something deep inside refused to let her stop searching. Richard had always been meticulous. He labeled tools, organized paperwork, and kept careful records of everything from tax returns to appliance warranties. If he had hidden something, he would have hidden it well. Late that afternoon, Margaret entered the garage searching for old boxes she had never bothered to open. Dust-covered shelves filled with decades of memories, including fishing equipment Richard hadn't used in years, paint cans from home improvement projects, and camping gear packed neatly inside weathered plastic containers. As she moved a stack of cardboard boxes aside, her eyes landed on a faded file folder tucked behind an old toolbox. Inside were receipts, insurance papers, and several documents related to a storage unit rented nearly 15 years earlier. Margaret remembered asking Richard about it when a monthly payments first appeared in their bank statements. He had smiled and explained that he needed extra space for old furniture inherited from relatives because the garage had become too crowded. It seemed reasonable at the time. Eventually, she stopped asking about it altogether. According to the paperwork, however, the storage unit was still being paid for every month through automatic withdrawals from their checking account. Margaret frowned. If it contained nothing more than old furniture, why keep paying for it year after year? She searched her memory, realizing she had never once visited the facility. Richard had always gone alone whenever the payment notice arrived, or whenever he claimed he needed to organize the contents. Suddenly, the brass key resting in her pocket felt heavier than before. Without allowing herself time to reconsider, Margaret picked up her car keys, folded the storage documents in her purse, and began driving across town toward a place she should have visited many years earlier. The storage facility sat on the outskirts of town behind a chain-link fence, surrounded by rows of identical metal doors stretching farther than Margaret expected. The office looked unchanged since the early 1990s, with faded signs advertising climate-controlled units and handwritten notices taped to the front window. When Margaret stepped inside, an older manager looked up from behind the counter. His expression immediately softened with recognition. "Mrs. Ellis," he said gently, "I'm so sorry about Richard. He was one of the nicest people who ever rented here." Margaret thanked him quietly before explaining that she needed access to her husband's storage unit. The manager nodded, typed Richard's information into his computer, then hesitated. His friendly expression shifted into one of visible confusion. After several awkward seconds, he looked back at Margaret and asked a question she never expected to hear. "I thought his daughter was coming instead." Margaret blinked, certain she had misunderstood him. "My daughter?" she asked. The manager slowly shook his head. "No, the other one." Silence settled between them. Margaret felt the room grow strangely cold despite the summer heat outside. "Richard only had 2 children," she replied carefully. The manager's face lost all color. Realizing he had said something he wasn't supposed to, he immediately apologized and insisted he must have been mistaken. But the damage had already been done. One simple sentence had created another impossible question. Who was the other daughter he believed existed? Before Margaret could press him further, he handed her the access paperwork and quietly pointed toward Unit 214 at the far end of the property. Margaret walked slowly between rows of storage buildings until she found the weathered metal door marked 214. Her hands trembled as she unlocked the heavy padlock. The brass key from the funeral didn't fit the outside lock, forcing her to use the key provided by the manager instead. She pulled the metal door upward, expecting to find worn-out furniture covered in dusty blankets, just as Richard had always claimed. Instead, she froze where she stood. The unit contained almost no furniture at all. Metal shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with carefully labeled boxes arranged with Richard's usual precision. Thick binders sat beside neatly stacked photo albums. Filing cabinets occupied one corner, while several sealed plastic containers filled another. Everything appeared organized, intentional, and frequently maintained. This wasn't forgotten storage. Someone had visited regularly. Margaret stepped inside slowly, her heartbeat growing louder with every passing second. Resting on a wooden table at the center of the room was an old cedar chest secured by a polished brass lock. She reached into her pocket almost without thinking. The mysterious key from the funeral fit perfectly into the lock with a quiet click. For several long moments, Margaret simply stared at the unopened chest, afraid that lifting the lid might destroy the last remaining pieces of the life she believed she understood. She took one slow breath, placed both hands on the weathered wood, and gently raised the lid, completely unaware that the first item waiting inside would change everything she thought she knew about Richard Ellis. Margaret Ellis stood motionless in front of the open cedar chest, her hands resting on its worn wooden edges, as though she needed something solid to keep herself from collapsing. She had expected to find financial records, perhaps an old family heirloom, or even documents Richard had simply forgotten to mention over the years. Instead, the first thing she saw was a neatly arranged stack of photographs secured with a faded blue ribbon that looked as though it had been tied decades earlier. With trembling fingers, she untied the ribbon and lifted the top photograph into the light filtering through the storage unit's half-open door. Richard smiled back at her exactly as she remembered him, only he appeared noticeably younger, wearing a denim jacket she had never seen before. Standing beside him was the same woman who had approached her at the funeral, dressed casually in jeans and a cream-colored sweater, smiling as naturally as if they had known each other forever. Between them stood a little girl, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, holding both of their hands while laughing at something beyond the camera. Margaret stared at the picture until her eyes blurred with tears. She quickly searched the back of the photograph, hoping to find an explanation, but all she discovered was a handwritten date from nearly 28 years earlier and 3 words written in Richard's unmistakable handwriting: "Our perfect Sunday." Margaret felt her knees weaken. She sat slowly on an old wooden chair nearby, unable to understand how the man she had shared nearly 4 decades with could appear in a photograph that suggested an entirely different family, living an entirely different life. As she continued turning over one photograph after another, the impossible slowly became undeniable. There were birthday celebrations with balloons and homemade cakes, Thanksgiving dinners around a different dining table, 4th of July picnics, fishing trips beside lakes Margaret had never visited, and Christmas mornings inside a house she didn't recognize. Richard appeared in every image, growing older year after year, just as he had beside Margaret. Yet these memories belonged to someone else. The woman from the funeral appeared in almost every photograph, never looking uncomfortable or uncertain. She wasn't standing in the background like a friend or co-worker. She stood beside Richard exactly the way Margaret had stood beside him in hundreds of family pictures stored in albums back home. The little girl gradually grew into a teenager and then a young woman, always looking at Richard with the unmistakable affection of a daughter looking at her father. Margaret counted the years carefully. Some of the photographs had been taken during summers when Richard had told her he was attending business conferences several states away. Others matched weekends he claimed veterans organizations had invited him to volunteer at special events. She suddenly remembered countless occasions when he had left home carrying only a small overnight bag, promising he would return in 2 or 3 days. She had never questioned him because Richard had never given her a reason to doubt his word. Now, those ordinary trips seemed to carry an entirely different meaning. Every explanation he had offered over the years began rearranging itself inside her mind, forming a picture she could no longer ignore. Margaret forced herself to keep searching through the chest, desperate to find anything that might explain what she was seeing. Beneath the photographs lay dozens of carefully organized envelopes tied together with string. Every envelope contained handwritten letters spanning more than 25 years. Most were addressed simply to Richard, while others began with words that made Margaret's heart ache even more. To my wonderful husband, thank you for another beautiful anniversary. I can't wait until you're home again. Margaret recognized none of the handwriting, yet every letter reflected a woman who believed she was writing to the only man she had ever loved. There were stories about family dinners, neighborhood gatherings, birthdays, medical appointments, and ordinary moments that mirrored the same life Margaret believed she alone had shared with Richard. But what disturbed her most was what the letters did not contain. There was no hint that the writer knew Margaret existed. No apology, no guilt, no acknowledgement of another family. Whoever this woman was, she wrote with complete confidence that Richard belonged entirely to her. Margaret felt a strange mixture of heartbreak and compassion growing inside her. If these letters were genuine, then the woman at the funeral had not come to destroy Margaret's life. She had come carrying the weight of a truth that had shattered her own. Inside another folder, Margaret discovered official documents protected in plastic sleeves. There was a birth certificate for the little girl from the photographs. Her name was Hannah Brooks, and under the line marked father, the document listed Richard Ellis. Margaret stared at the page so long that the printed words almost seemed to move. Richard had another daughter, not a distant relative, not a foster child, his daughter. The realization struck with such force that Margaret had to steady herself against the table. She immediately calculated Hannah's age. 29. That meant Hannah had been born nearly a decade after Margaret and Richard celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary. During that same year, Margaret remembered decorating a nursery for their own son, Michael, while Richard frequently traveled for what he claimed were work assignments requiring weekend meetings. She had trusted every explanation without hesitation because trust had always seemed easier than suspicion. Now she understood something that frightened her more than the existence of another family itself. Maintaining two completely separate lives for nearly 3 decades required planning, discipline, and extraordinary deception. Richard hadn't made one terrible mistake. He had protected a carefully constructed secret every single day for years, returning home each time as though nothing unusual had happened. Margaret could hardly comprehend the emotional burden such a life must have required. Yet she also couldn't understand how someone capable of such deception had remained so calm, patient, and loving throughout the marriage she thought they shared. Just as Margaret considered leaving the storage unit to catch her breath, her eyes fell upon one final envelope resting alone beneath everything else inside the cedar chest. Unlike the others, it wasn't tied with ribbon or grouped with family photographs. Across the front, written in Richard's familiar handwriting, were only 4 words, for Margaret. Please read. Her hands trembled so violently that she almost dropped it before she even opened it. She could feel the thickness of several folded pages inside, enough to suggest Richard had written a confession far longer than a simple farewell. Margaret held the envelope against her chest for several long moments, struggling to decide whether she truly wanted the answers waiting inside. Part of her wanted to tear it open immediately. Another part wanted to throw it back into the chest, lock everything away, and spend the rest of her life pretending none of it had ever existed. But one question refused to leave her mind. If Richard had taken the time to write directly to her before he died, then perhaps he had known this day would eventually come. Perhaps he had expected someone to bring Margaret to this very place after his funeral. Slowly, she slipped the unopened envelope into her purse instead of reading it there. She wasn't ready. Not yet. First, she needed to find the woman in black. Because after everything she had just discovered, Margaret realized that the stranger at the funeral might be the only person still alive who knew the full truth about the man. Margaret Ellis drove home from the storage facility with the unopened letter resting inside her purse like a weight she could not escape. More than once, she pulled into empty parking lots, reached for the envelope, and almost broke the seal. Yet every time her fingers touched the paper, she stopped. She wasn't afraid of reading Richard's words. She was afraid of believing them. A letter written by a dying man could explain anything, justify anything, or leave behind one final version of the truth that no one would ever be able to challenge. Margaret realized that before she allowed Richard to tell his side of the story, she needed to hear from the woman whose face appeared in decades of photographs hidden inside the cedar chest. Whoever she was, she had lived through the same years Margaret had, loved the same man, and unknowingly shared a life that should never have been possible. If there were answers to be found, they would begin with her. Before leaving the storage unit, Margaret had searched every box until she found a recent utility bill with a name and address neatly clipped to the front of a folder. The name printed there matched the birth certificate she had discovered only minutes earlier. Evelyn Brooks. The address was less than 90 miles away in a quiet lakeside town Margaret had driven through countless times without ever imagining that someone connected to Richard lived there. As the miles passed beneath her tires, Margaret found herself wondering whether Evelyn had spent those same decades believing she was Richard's only wife, or whether she had always known about the hidden life he returned to whenever he disappeared. The neighborhood was peaceful, lined with modest brick homes, carefully trimmed lawns, and large maple trees that shaded the streets from the afternoon sun. Nothing about the place suggested scandal or secrecy. It looked like the kind of community where neighbors waved to one another from their front porches and children still rode bicycles until sunset. Margaret parked across the street from the address on the utility bill and sat quietly for several minutes, staring at the white house with blue shutters. A flower garden stretched beneath the front windows, blooming with colors Richard had always admired. She remembered how he often insisted on planting fresh flowers every spring, saying a home should always look welcoming. That memory suddenly hurt in a way she couldn't explain. Had he learned that love of gardening here? Or had he shared the same hobby with two different families, carefully dividing his time between them? Before Margaret could lose her nerve, the front door opened. Evelyn Brooks stepped outside, carrying a watering can, moving slowly through the flower beds with the quiet rhythm of someone who had repeated the same routine for years. She looked older than she had at the funeral, perhaps because grief had settled across her face more heavily than Margaret had first noticed. For a brief moment, Margaret considered turning around and driving away forever. Instead, she crossed the street, stopped at the edge of the walkway, and softly called Evelyn's name. The older woman looked up immediately. There was no surprise in her eyes, only sadness. It was almost as though she had been expecting Margaret to arrive. For several long seconds, neither woman spoke. They simply looked at one another, connected by the same man and separated by a truth neither had chosen. Finally, Evelyn set the watering can down and invited Margaret inside, without asking why she had come. The living room felt warm and familiar, decorated with framed family photographs, shelves filled with books, and an old grandfather clock ticking softly in the corner. Margaret's eyes immediately found the photographs lining the fireplace. Richard appeared in several of them, smiling exactly as he had in the albums hidden inside the storage unit. There was no attempt to hide who he was. No pictures had been turned over or removed after the funeral. Everything remained exactly where it had always been, as though Evelyn refused to erase the years they had shared despite everything that had happened. Margaret noticed framed photographs of a young woman from the storage unit as well. Hannah Brooks had grown into a confident adult with Richard's unmistakable smile. Before Margaret could ask the question burning inside her, Evelyn quietly placed 2 cups of coffee on the table and spoke first. "I suppose you've opened the chest by now," she said. Margaret nodded slowly, unable to trust her own voice. Evelyn looked toward one of the photographs on the mantel before continuing. "Richard told me that if anything ever happened to him before he found the courage to tell the truth himself, someone would have to help you understand. He asked me not to come looking for you while he was alive. He said it would destroy too many lives. I hated that decision every single day." Margaret listened in stunned silence as Evelyn began sharing a story that sounded almost impossible. She explained that she had met Richard 31 years earlier during a charity fundraiser for military veterans. He introduced himself as a widower who had lost his wife years before and was raising a young son on his own. He never wore a wedding ring when he was with Evelyn. He never hesitated when speaking about the future. Over time, they fell deeply in love, eventually exchanging private vows in a small ceremony attended by only a few close friends who believed Richard's story without question. Evelyn admitted that she had spent decades believing she was helping a lonely man rebuild his life after unimaginable loss. She had never searched for another wife because she had never imagined one existed. Whenever Richard disappeared for several days, he explained that business consulting required frequent travel across the Midwest. Sometimes he claimed he was helping veterans settle legal matters in different states. Other times, he said aging relatives needed his assistance. His explanations were always calm, detailed, and believable. Margaret felt tears forming as she realized the same stories Richard had used with one family had simply been adjusted and repeated to the other. Neither woman had stolen someone else's husband. Neither had knowingly betrayed the other. Both had trusted the same man with complete confidence, and both had spent decades believing they were living the only version of his life. Then Evelyn quietly stood, walked toward an antique writing desk near the window, and removed another sealed envelope from the top drawer. Unlike the letter resting unopened inside Margaret's purse, this envelope had already been opened many times. Its edges were worn, and the paper inside had been carefully folded again after each reading. Evelyn held it gently before placing it in front of Margaret. "Richard wrote one for you," she said softly. "He wrote one for me, too. I read mine the night before his funeral because it arrived with instructions not to open it unless he was gone." Margaret looked down at the envelope, then back at Evelyn, who continued with a sentence that sent another chill through the room. The secret wasn't just that he had two families. She paused, struggling to steady her voice. That was only the part he believed we would discover first. The truth he feared most wasn't about us at all. It began many years before either of us ever met him. Margaret felt her pulse quicken as Evelyn slowly pushed the worn envelope across the table. Whatever Richard had hidden for more than 3 decades reached far beyond 2 marriages. Somewhere in the pages of those letters lay the reason a man described by everyone as honest and compassionate had spent half his life protecting a secret so enormous that he believed it could only be revealed after his death. Margaret reached in her purse, placed Richard's unopened letter beside Evelyn's, and realized that before the sun set, she would finally hear the voice of the man whose silence had changed both of their lives forever. Margaret Ellis sat in complete silence as the 2 envelopes rested on the coffee table between her and Evelyn Brooks. For nearly 40 years, Richard Ellis had been the one person she believed she understood better than anyone else. Now, after discovering another family, another daughter, another home, and another woman who had unknowingly loved the same man, she realized she was about to hear his voice one final time, not through memory, but through words he had carefully chosen before his death. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Evelyn's living room, yet neither woman noticed the passing hours. They had both reached a point where the truth mattered more than the pain it might cause. Margaret slowly picked up the envelope addressed to her. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal, unfolding several neatly written pages in Richard's familiar handwriting. She recognized every curve of every letter. It was the same handwriting that had filled birthday cards, anniversary notes, grocery lists taped to the refrigerator, and little reminders he would leave beside the coffee maker whenever he left town. Seeing it now filled her with an overwhelming mixture of comfort and heartbreak. She took one slow breath before beginning to read, knowing that every sentence might permanently change the way she remembered the man she had buried only days earlier. Richard began by apologizing, not with excuses or explanations, but with a simple acknowledgement that no apology could ever repair the damage his choices had caused. He wrote that he had lived with guilt every single day for more than 3 decades and had often sat awake at night wondering whether the next sunrise would finally be the day he confessed everything. Yet every time he gathered the courage to speak, fear convinced him to remain silent just a little longer. He admitted that he never stopped loving Margaret, never stopped loving their children, and never considered any moment of their marriage to be fake. Those words should have comforted her, but instead, they made the betrayal feel even more painful. Richard explained that people often imagine lies as something spoken in a single moment, but the most dangerous lies are the ones that demand new lies every day simply to survive. He confessed that his greatest mistake had not been telling one lie. It had been believing he could continue protecting everyone he loved by refusing to tell the truth. With each passing year, the secret grew larger until it became impossible to reveal without destroying every life connected to it. He described himself not as a victim, but as a man who lacked the courage to face the consequences of one terrible decision made long before Margaret had ever entered his life. The next pages revealed the beginning of a story Margaret had never imagined. More than 40 years earlier, Before meeting either Margaret or Evelyn, Richard had been involved in a devastating car accident while driving home late one winter evening. According to his letter, another driver crossed the center line during a snowstorm, causing a violent collision that claimed the other man's life. Investigators ruled the accident unavoidable, and Richard was never charged with any crime. But the tragedy left him emotionally broken. The man who died had been carrying documents, personal belongings, and family photographs because he was in the process of relocating after accepting a new job several states away. Richard attended the funeral quietly, consumed by guilt even though the accident had not legally been his fault. There he met members of the man's extended family, listening as they spoke about dreams that would never be fulfilled. Something inside Richard changed forever that day. He became obsessed with helping the grieving family financially without revealing his identity, believing it was the only way he could ease the burden he carried. What began as anonymous acts of kindness slowly grew into regular contact with relatives who never realized he was the driver involved in the accident. Years later, through those connections, he met Evelyn. She knew him only as a compassionate volunteer who devoted his free time to helping families affected by tragedy. Richard never intended for friendship to become love, but by the time he realized what was happening, he had already hidden too much of his past to tell the truth without losing everything. Instead of confessing, he made the worst decision of his life. He convinced himself he could somehow protect both worlds forever. Margaret lowered the letter, unable to speak. The room remained silent, except for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock. Richard's confession did not erase the deception, but it revealed something she had not expected. He had never lived two separate lives because he enjoyed the excitement or sought adventure. He had trapped himself inside a decision that became more impossible to escape with every passing year. Evelyn quietly unfolded her own letter and confirmed that Richard had written almost the same confession to her. He admitted loving both families deeply while recognizing that love could never justify dishonesty. He accepted full responsibility for every birthday missed, every fabricated business trip, every holiday divided between two homes, and every promise built upon silence. Then came the final pages of Margaret's letter. Richard revealed that the mysterious brass key had never been intended to unlock the cedar chest alone. It was meant to unlock the truth. He explained that he had arranged for Evelyn to attend a funeral only if he died before confessing in person. He knew Margaret deserved answers, and he trusted Evelyn to deliver the key because she had become the only other person carrying the same unbearable burden. His final request was not for forgiveness. Instead, he asked Margaret and Evelyn to meet, share everything they knew, and free themselves from the weight he had carried alone for decades. He ended with words Margaret would remember for the rest of her life. "If you cannot remember me with love, remember me with honesty. I failed you in life. Please don't let my silence continue after I'm gone." Margaret slowly folded the letter and looked toward Evelyn. For the first time since the funeral, she no longer saw the woman across from her as a stranger connected to betrayal. She saw another person whose heart had been broken by the same man, another woman forced to rebuild her life around a truth neither of them had ever asked to discover. Together they understood that the greatest secret Richard Ellis had hidden was not simply another family. It was the fear that had ruled every decision he made until the very end. And with that realization, only one chapter remained before the full weight of his choices would finally come to rest. Several weeks passed before Margaret Ellis returned to the cemetery where Richard had been laid to rest. During those quiet days, she had replayed every memory of their 38 years together, no longer searching for proof that he had deceived her, because that truth had already been established beyond doubt. Instead, she searched for the moments that had been real. She remembered the night Richard stayed awake beside her hospital bed after the birth of their daughter, refusing to leave even when the nurses insisted he needed rest. She remembered the evenings they danced barefoot in the kitchen while dinner cooked on the stove because an old love song happened to come on the radio. She remembered the pride in his eyes when their son graduated from college, the tears he tried to hide when their first grandchild was born, and the countless mornings he kissed her forehead before leaving the house. Those memories had once seemed simple. Now they carried a painful question. Had those moments been genuine, or had they simply been another part of a carefully managed life? The answer came to Margaret slowly, not from Richard's letters, but from her own heart. She realized that love and deception had existed together in the same man. One did not erase the other. Richard had loved her deeply, yet he had also betrayed her profoundly. Accepting both truths at once became the hardest lesson of her life. Healing did not come from pretending one truth canceled the other. It came from acknowledging that human beings are capable of extraordinary kindness and devastating mistakes at the very same time. Margaret had spoken with Evelyn several times since reading Richard's confession. What began as cautious conversations gradually became long afternoons spent sharing photographs, family stories, and memories that neither woman had ever imagined discussing together. They laughed through tears as they realized Richard had told the same terrible jokes in both homes, always burning hamburgers during summer cookouts because he insisted he could never master the grill, always falling asleep halfway through old Western movies, and always pretending he wasn't secretly feeding scraps of food to the family dog beneath the dinner table. They discovered that he had given both women nearly identical anniversary necklaces only 3 years apart, believing each gift was unique. They compared family vacations and slowly recognized how carefully Richard had arranged his schedule, dividing holidays, birthdays, and weekends with astonishing precision. It became painfully clear that maintaining two families had required years of planning that neither woman could fully understand. Yet something unexpected happened as they shared those memories. The resentment they might have directed toward one another never arrived. Instead, they found comfort in realizing that neither had knowingly participated in the deception. Both had trusted a man they believed was worthy of that trust. Neither had stolen someone else's happiness. They had simply believed the person they loved. In a strange way, their shared heartbreak became the foundation of an unlikely friendship neither expected nor sought, but one they both desperately needed. 1 month after the funeral, Margaret and Evelyn made a decision together. Rather than allowing Richard's secret to remain buried beneath shame and silence, they gathered both families for the first time. Margaret's children, Emily and Michael, arrived carrying years of grief that suddenly felt even heavier after learning the truth. Hannah Brooks came with Evelyn, equally uncertain about what the afternoon might bring. The first few moments were painfully awkward. No one knew exactly what to say. Faces that resembled Richard in different ways looked at one another across the room with curiosity, sadness, and disbelief. Then something remarkable happened. Instead of arguing over the man who had connected them, they began sharing stories about him. Emily described how Richard taught her to ride a bicycle without training wheels. Hannah smiled through tears and admitted he had done exactly the same for her. Michael remembered fishing trips at a quiet lake outside Columbus. Hannah quietly reached into her purse and produced a photograph of Richard teaching her to cast a fishing line at that very same lake only a year later. One by one, the walls between two families slowly disappeared. They realized they had all been living separate chapters of the same unfinished story. Richard's choices had divided their lives, but his death had unexpectedly brought them together. The pain remained, but so did the possibility that something meaningful could still emerge from years of hidden truth. On a crisp autumn afternoon, nearly 3 months after Richard's funeral, Margaret and Evelyn stood side by side before his headstone. The flowers placed there were fresh, brought not by one family, but by two. Margaret looked down at the engraved name she had once believed represented a simple, honest life. She understood now that every person leaves behind more than dates carved in a stone. They leave memories, regrets, unanswered questions, and lessons for those who remain. Richard Ellis had failed the people he loved in ways that could never be undone. He had carried secrets that eventually wounded everyone closest to him. But his story also revealed something Margaret wished she had understood much earlier. Silence has a way of growing heavier with time. Every day we postpone an honest conversation. Every truth we hide out of fear. Every confession delayed until tomorrow quietly becomes another brick in a wall that eventually feels impossible to climb. Richard spent decades believing he was protecting the people he loved, when in reality he was only postponing the heartbreak until after his own voice was gone forever. In the end, the burden of revealing the truth fell upon those left behind. As Margaret turned to leave the cemetery, she glanced back one final time. She no longer saw only the husband she had lost. She saw a complicated man who had loved deeply, failed greatly, and spent years trapped inside choices he no longer knew how to escape. She chose not to let bitterness define the rest of her life. Forgiveness did not mean forgetting, nor did it excuse what Richard had done. It simply meant refusing to allow his mistakes to steal the future she still had ahead of her. She reached for Evelyn's hand, and together they walked away from the grave, not as rivals, not as strangers, but as two women whose lives had been forever connected by one man's hidden past and whose strength had carried them through a truth neither had ever expected to face. Sometimes the greatest tragedy is not that someone keeps a secret. It is waiting so long to tell the truth that the people who deserve answers are left searching for them after the storyteller is gone. And perhaps that is the lesson this story leaves behind for all of us. Tell the truth while you still have the chance. Say the words that matter while the people you love can still hear them. Because no confession, no matter how sincere, can ever replace a conversation that never happened. Thank you for watching Story Chamber. If this story touched your heart or made you think differently about trust, love, and forgiveness, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and share your thoughts below. Don't forget to subscribe to Story Chamber and turn on notifications so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.